Hello fam, and welcome to part 5 of the Southern Unsolved Mystery Iceberg Explained. Tonight, we dive into some of the weirdest and darkest mysteries that lie beneath the Mason-Dixon line. But first, I want to thank the members of my channel who voted to see this video series next. Thank you for all your support, and I hope you find this video interesting. So grab a can of cheerwine and assume the resting position as we go through a world of southern mysteries. Lake Lanier, Georgia. Lake Lanier is a large reservoir located in the northern part of Georgia. It was created by the construction of the Beaufort Dam on the Chattahoochee River in the 1950s. It's a pretty important lake in the region, considering it is a major source of drinking water for the city of Atlanta, as well as being a source of power generation and flood control. But it's also a very popular lake for recreation, especially with boaters, houseboats, jet skiers, etc. It sees about 8 to 10 million visitors annually and generates about $5 million a year in revenue. But what if I told you this lake was haunted? Or maybe cursed? Let's start where it was built, which was on top of multiple communities and cemeteries. Now that doesn't necessarily mean something's haunted, but when you get to looking at some of the tragedies associated with this lake, it's kind of bizarre. It's so bad that multiple podcasts, as well as hundreds of news stories, have covered this weird lake. And citing an article from 2023, the lake since its construction has seen nearly 700 deaths, many of these being labeled as strange, unexplained, and unsolved. 200 of those, or almost 29%, have occurred in the past 30 years. 27 of those deaths, a body was never recovered. The lake has also seen more than 500 boating accidents. Some of these where the boats just mysteriously went up into flames. It's said to be the most dangerous underwater surface in the US. Actually, it's one of the most dangerous lakes in the US period, and that's because it was built over these communities, where divers can still see relics of streets, walls, and houses at the bottom of the lake, along with at least 20 headstones and graves. And sometimes in a drought, boaters and swimmers become exposed to sunken boats, cars, and even the occasional body that surfaces. Rescue divers have also commented about how they are constantly being called out to do rescue and/or recovery calls. Even as I researched this mystery, I come across the tragedy of a 24-year-old man who, just in the past week or two, got electrocuted in the lake and then died the next day. While authorities have not released details on how he got electrocuted, it is known that boats can leak electrical currents into the water, and since he was near a boat dock, that's probably what happened. And in addition to this, 2 other people died in the lake that week, both from drowning. And if you're thinking, well, these deaths really just sound kinda like the average number of accidents that would occur at a lake with so many people visiting. However, you would be wrong. For comparison, Lake Allatoona is just 40 miles west of Lake Lanier and gets roughly the same number of visitors a year, yet has 1/3 of the amount of deaths. Keep in mind, we haven't even gotten to the ghost part yet. Many people have reported seeing a shadow figure sitting on a raft with a pole that he uses to guide himself forwards, backwards, and side to side across the lake while using a lantern to see. Others report seeing a woman in a flowing blue dress who died at the lake in the past, or a ghostly figure of a boy walking along the shore, while some swimmers have told stories about arms reaching up and grabbing them, not to mention hearing creepy sounds from beneath the water, such as church bells or cries for help. But why would it be haunted? Well, in addition to the leftover cemeteries, paranormal believers cite it as beginning with the Cherokee removal, which led to the Trail of Tears, and also other things that stain the past in this area, such as slavery. However, skeptics still believe that it can all be chalked up to debris under the water and people not taking precaution. But I ask you, what do you think? Santer, North Carolina. Santer is an alleged cryptid said to be a mysterious feline, most commonly seen in western North Carolina. And while not dangerous to humans, it has been known to be a predator of livestock. The cat's description is that of a long body covered with reddish, sometimes gray hair. It has a large bald head with small eyes, long legs, and a tail, which has 8 hard knots, kinda making it look like a string of beads. It can use that tail as a weapon, and its skill and power is enough to knock out a cow or a hog with one slap, which sounds like a cryptid we looked at in the Mega Unsolved series called the Silver Cat. The Santer, however, lives mostly in wooded swamps in the neighborhoods of small villages where livestock is kept. The cat is extremely quick and rarely seen, and its piercing baby-like wail even makes dogs scared to attack it. The first reported attack occurred on September 4th, 1890, in the Statesville Landmark, a newspaper in North Carolina. It recorded that a police officer by the name of Mr. Fettle claimed to have shot at it while it was after a dog. Tracks were found that next morning. This same cat was said to have eaten 7 pigs and 15 cows before a hunting party was finally established to go and kill the creature, but they never seen or heard it. But they did come by more tracks, which were about 8 inches long and 4 inches wide and looked similar to a bear. Around the same time, another newspaper would tell the story of a possum hunter who heard the cat scream, which scared his dogs off. Another man caught a glimpse of the cat, and he described the size as not quite big as a cow. Finally, it was sighted near a house by 2 widows, where it was said to be reared up against the door, growling at something. It would be another 7 years before sightings returned, this time at Roaring River, where it was seen eating pet cats. An article from this time suggested that it might actually be an escaped wildcat from a circus that came through a year before. Then, about a month later, the same creature was found feasting on cats and dogs before it was finally captured. It was described as looking like a large shepherd dog, but no one had ever seen anything like it. Unfortunately, no pictures exist. Then, if we jump ahead 2 years later, in 1899, 12 chickens would end up being killed and eaten by what was assumed to have been the same creature. A woman would then claim she seen the cat and it had a gray appearance and was between the size of a cat and dog. These sightings would occur off and on until the 1920s when it finally died off. So what was it? Most seem to think now that it was nothing more than a hoax, built upon the old lumberjack stories from the 19th century, and then hyped up by the newspapers for increased sales. Michael Bell, Tennessee, July 23, 1998. 21-year-old Michael Bell would go into his job at a convenience store located in Middleton, Tennessee, which is on the state line with Mississippi. Little could he know the tragedy that was about to befall him, because that morning, Michael, who was only working the summer job until he would be attending vocational school that fall, would be approached by a man with a gun who then promptly shot him and fled back to Mississippi. And crazily enough, this man's face was captured on security video, and while the quality is not as nice as what we have nowadays, most would think it's good enough to have at least led to an identification. However, that never happened. And I know you're watching this and thinking, yeah, that's an awful story, and while technically a mystery, convenience stores get robbed all the time, and unfortunately, the clerks sometimes die, so it's not really that big of a mystery. But, actually it is. Let me explain. Investigators initially thought it was a robbery gone bad. I mean, who wouldn't think that? The screenshot clearly shows the man reaching over into the register and stealing money, right? True, but investigators would uncover that the robbery was not the motive. The man actually came in just to murder Michael and took advantage of the fact that he had opened the cash register. So what was the motive? Was it revenge? No. Was it about a debt owed? No. Were they fighting over a girl? No. And this is where the story takes a dark and very interesting turn. It appears Michael was the victim of a contract killing, and while those do happen, why would anyone target a 21-year-old about to start vocational school? When you think of someone putting out a hit on someone, you think about drug connections, or the mafia, or heck, even spouses. But Michael, as far as we know, was connected to none of that, nor was he married. 4 years later, in January 2002, a segment on America's Most Wanted was aired about the murder, and it resulted in several good leads, as well as a sketch, which I am unable to find. The FBI joined the case in 2017, nearly 20 years after the fact, and the reward was increased to $24,000. And since they've joined, some new promising leads have been investigated, and the case made progress up until 2019, when the Department of Justice announced their intent to take over the investigation. They even released enhanced images of the security footage along with the vehicle. That car was said to be a late 90s model GM sedan, yet nothing, which is strange that this suspect has not been seen or heard of again, or at least no one's talking if he has been. This has led to speculation that it was a professional hitman from out of town, which gets back to the mystery. Why on earth did Michael have a hit put out on him? Victor Shoemaker Jr., West Virginia. May 1st, 1994. 5-year-old Victor Shoemaker had been attending a family reunion with his mother in the small town of Kirby, West Virginia. That day, he would go off into the woods behind his grandfather's home, following behind his older cousins, who were 8 and 9 years old at the time. The boys were out shooting their BB gun when they started to notice the younger Victor being unable to keep up. However, they still kept their eye on him. The 3 boys would then come up to an abandoned trailer in the woods. It was about 8:30 p.m. at this time, and Victor started asking to go home, stating that he was hungry. The older cousins, however, were not ready to go and would not take him back. So Victor, this little 5-year-old, would set off back on his way alone to his grandfather's house. A little while later, Victor's cousins would arrive back, expecting to find Victor there, but to their surprise, he had never made it back. This, of course, set off alarm bells to Victor's mother, who started hitting the boys up with questions about what happened to him. And unfortunately, the kids, well, they lied, because they had been told to watch Victor and take care of him. And not only that, they were told specifically to stay away from the abandoned trailers in the area. So instead of telling them where they had last seen him, which was at one of these trailers, they lied and claimed to have last seen him somewhere else, which threw off the search for the first hour. However, they did eventually admit to their lie and told the truth about seeing him walking away from the trailer, about a half a mile from their grandfather's home. However, Victor was never found. Investigators started to wonder if maybe some kind of accident had happened, or maybe even the boys had intentionally harmed him. But both boys passed polygraph tests, along with a specifically designed exam for children. One of the boys' mothers also passed the polygraph, along with Victor's father. But strangely, one of those boys, when asked what they thought had happened, said, quote, "Somebody hiding behind a tree got up and grabbed him or shot him," end quote, which is a little disturbing. Detectives came to the conclusion that Victor simply got lost on the walk back to his grandfather's and died of exposure, which had some validity. It was getting dark, and the terrain was very rocky and difficult to navigate. It also rained just a few days later, and the temperatures dropped significantly, leading to the thought that he succumbed to hypothermia. However, Victor's father heavily disputed this because his son was very familiar with the area, because like a lot of kids in country areas, they spend a lot of time in the woods, and while investigators stated their belief was he succumbed to the elements, law enforcement would release something kinda odd. They would all of a sudden announce that they were looking to speak to a driver of a dark blue 1990 model pickup that was seen around the time and area where Victor was last spotted. It was stated that the main road that came through this area was not well traveled, and they hoped this driver may have relevant info about what happened to Victor, which certainly kinda seems like maybe they didn't think it was the elements after all. And just like the other 411 stories, the entire forested area was searched extensively, and not one clue was ever found, even calling in helicopters, dogs, the National Guard, as well as the FBI, who were contacted with the thought that foul play may have occurred. However, no sign of Victor was ever found. Miss X, Alabama. April 18th, 1982, Romulus, Alabama. 3 men were fishing along a place called Slaughter Creek near the banks of Black Warrior River. Not long after the men arrived, did they see what they thought was a large log covered in weeds off the riverbank. As they got closer, they were shocked to realize that it was the body of a woman, which lay partially submerged in the water. Of course, the fishermen went back to call the police, who arrived shortly later to collect the remains and take them back for an autopsy, the results of which were pretty disturbing. The woman had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and then strangled. And craziest of all, it had happened within the past 24 hours of being found by the fishermen, possibly within just a few hours. They also found that the woman was about 30 to 40 years old, with a healthy reddish complexion, which indicated to them that she was frequently engaged in outdoor activities and may have performed manual labor. It was also found that she had given birth at some point in the past. Investigators would try to retrace her steps and establish exactly what had happened. At the scene, they did find signs of a struggle, indicating the murder had taken place there, and it's also possible that she was attacked while fishing. A group of campers were also interviewed shortly after the body was found. These campers had actually set their tent up close to where the body was, but didn't hear, see, or smell anything out of the ordinary. This is when a second group of witnesses came forward. They had been riding three-wheelers in the area when they seen a woman matching the Jane Doe's description on the 16th, just days before. They claimed a man that was between 35 and 40 years old was with her. They drove a 1973 or 1974 Ford LTD with a dark vinyl top and possible front end damage. The car had become stuck in the mud along a road. This woman had asked the group, while the man remained sitting in the car, they would note that he was visibly upset and blaming the woman for getting stuck. This man has never been identified, but was described as being a white man with a healthy reddish complexion, as well as having a shaven face, and being around 6'1", 180 to 200 pounds, with a muscular build. However, it cannot be certain that this incident or people are related to Miss X, and investigators theorized at first she was probably killed by a local, considering where the body was found. She, on the other hand, is believed to have not been local, and instead was probably a drifter. They believe this because they actually got a good photo of her post-mortem, which I won't show here, but you can find pretty easily online, and the sketches made of her are also pretty accurate. Yet, no one local recognized her. Her body was exhumed in 2003 to extract DNA, but even after 4 decades, we have no idea who this woman is. The Crossroads Tavern Massacre, Texas. On the night of June 24th, 1981, in the town of Port Lavaca, Texas, a woman named Merrill Ball was sitting at home anxiously awaiting the arrival of her 43-year-old husband, William. As the night wore on, she began to worry, but assumed that he had stopped to have a drink. She would fall asleep soon, though, and woke up the next morning to realize William never made it home. Knowing this was certainly unusual, she decided to go check out the Crossroads Tavern, a place where he would occasionally stop to drink. She made it there around 6:30 a.m. and found his vehicle, and went inside, and what she found was a pretty grisly scene. Actually, it was a massacre. William, along with 3 women, all lay in pools of blood on the floor. William was the only one who still clung to life. Merrill would hurriedly call the police. William was rushed to the hospital, where it looked pretty grim. He had been shot in the head and chest, and had a slash through his stomach. 66-year-old manager, Lenny York, was already dead, along with 19-year-old waitress, Margie Matoka, and a 21-year-old, Lark Saylor, who was a semi-regular customer to the establishment. All 3 had been beaten and murdered execution style. Autopsies on the women began almost immediately, and found that all 3 had died between 12 and 1 a.m. And here is where we come across the first problem with this mystery. The small town sheriff's department had no experience with something like this. They were completely baffled and shocked and had no idea what to do. They did know robbery was not the motive, because no money was taken and everyone's valuables were left untouched. Another issue was the fact that it had been 50-cent beer night, and an estimated 100 people had visited and left numerous fingerprints. But in a brain-numbingly dumb move, the sheriff's department decided not to take any fingerprints because of that reason. No murder weapon was found, but 8 shell casings were. Police started to look for what kind of knife created William's injury, but soon realized that his injury came after William fell onto a broken door hinge as he tried to crawl to a phone to call police. William himself would cling to life for about a month before eventually succumbing to his wounds. Before he died, law enforcement stated that he had provided critical evidence to help solve the case, and they believed it would meet a resolution soon. However, the case quickly went cold, and it would be a year before the sheriff would finally announce that they had a suspect and that an arrest was imminent. But again, nothing came of it. A task force was set up 2 years after the murders, though. They found a stolen car hidden in a shed that seemed like it might be related. However, police would never confirm this, only saying that one of the men captured was a business associate of one of the victims. Another investigator would end up chasing leads down in 3 states, coming up with 3,000 pages worth of reports. This investigation led up to a dozen arrests of people for other crimes, yet were unrelated to the actual murders. The case was then joined by the Texas Rangers, the FBI, and ATF, which also offered no resolution. And 4 decades later, the massacre is still unsolved. Mary Little, Georgia. Mary Little, a 25-year-old secretary at a bank in Atlanta, was a newlywed of 6 weeks who was at the center of this crazy mystery. On the evening of October 14th, 1965, Mary's husband Roy was out of town for work and expected to be home the next day, where they were going to have dinner. So after work, Mary would go buy some groceries for that dinner and met a female co-worker at a cafe before the two went window shopping at a mall. They then parted ways at 8 p.m. The next morning, Mary did not show up for work, nor did she call in, which was very unusual, so much so that her boss called the apartment complex to speak to Mary's landlord, who told him the morning newspaper was still on her sidewalk. The landlord agreed to go check on her, and entering her apartment, found it empty. Her boss then contacted the co-worker that she had spent the previous evening with, and found that Mary had parked at the mall where they had been. The boss in turn called the security at that mall, and they went and looked for Mary's car and found that it was not there. However, after not hearing anything around noon, her boss decided to drive over himself and check it out, and he seen Mary's car was still at the mall. Inside the vehicle was even more perplexing: bags of groceries, a small amount of blood, and a slip, panties, a girdle, bra, and a single stocking, which had been folded on the console between the seats. The car was also coated with the red dust, suggesting that it was driven on a dirt road, and was also later found that it had been driven 41 miles. After law enforcement was called, they come to the conclusion that whoever abducted her took her car and brought it back, seemingly just before her boss arrived, but after the security guards looked for it. By nighttime, the story was the talk of the town. Detectives would talk to the co-worker that Mary was last seen with at the mall, and she relayed to them that Mary never acted like anything was wrong, or that she potentially worried about anything. However, a friend from high school came forward after and stated that Mary had confided in her about her fear of being alone in her home and car. Investigators also learned a secret admirer had sent her flowers, yet the florist had no details on who the person was buying them. But this is where the case takes a weird turn. A month later, Mary's credit card was found to have been used at a Charlotte gas station 250 miles away. That charge showed that it happened the morning after her disappearance, and then another charge later that afternoon in Raleigh, 400 miles away. And both receipts had Mary's signature, and even when compared by handwriting experts, was deemed to match. Detectives wasted no time going to these gas stations to see if these men may have remembered anything at all about that night, and they were surprised to find out that the gas station attendant in Charlotte remembered the woman. He stated she had a cut on her head and was trying to hide her face, and traveling in the company of a man who was giving her orders. And at the gas station in Raleigh, the attendant there said he had seen her and that she had blood on her legs and was traveling with 2 men. Even stranger was Charlotte was Mary's hometown before she moved to Atlanta. Why would this man, or these men, take her back to where she could be recognized and make her get out while she was bloody and pay for gas? I mean, that's pretty stupid, but I guess it did work, because she was never seen again. Investigators never got a good description of the car she was spotted in, nor did they find out where Mary's car had disappeared to that morning, although someone had placed a stolen license plate from Charlotte on her car, which might be why the security guards at the mall could never find it. As far as theories go, there are a few. Her husband Roy was a person of interest in spite of having an alibi out of town. All of Mary's friends did not like him and spoke poorly of him, and he really didn't seem to care that Mary had vanished. He also refused to take a lie detector test. Others point to her place of employment, which was investigated for a couple of ongoing scandals, one of those being possible prostitution occurring on the property. There's also the thought that it might have been the secret admirer who had been calling her and sending flowers. Bear King of Marble Falls, Texas. On the afternoon of May 15, 1901, in Marble Falls, Texas, a girl named Ramey Arlen was out tending to a sheep flock on one of her family's farms. Her mom would all of a sudden hear Ramey scream and then hear what she thought was the roar of a panther. She would grab her gun and run outside to where Ramey was supposed to be, but found that she was gone. She would then begin to search the woods, finding nothing. Her mother then went back home and told neighbors, who would quickly form a search party and go look for Ramey. This search would go on into the night, and they too were unable to find her. But the next day, a local hunter did find Ramey wandering around in the woods aimlessly, several miles away from her home. She would claim that she had been grabbed by a bear man who brought her to a cave in the mountains and struck her anytime she tried to escape. She eventually waited till this creature went to sleep before escaping. Once Mary was taken back to her family and the town was told of what had happened, they would form a hunting party to go and find this creature, and they eventually did find its cave and the beast, which growled like a panther and beat its chest. It was said to look human-like, and the men hesitated at shooting it, but when this cryptid charged them, they had no choice. They left no account of what they did with the body afterwards. Surprisingly, this story was told in a couple of major newspapers across the country, but it first appeared in one called the Washington Bee, based in DC. From the article, Ramey would state, quote, "I was walking along a narrow trail when a large black bear suddenly appeared in front of me. He quickly turned to run away when a curious-looking animal, running on 4 feet, sprang out of the chaparral into the trail. I saw at a glance that the monster in some way resembled a human being," end quote. She would then go on to say that this creature seized her and carried her off into the mountains. So what was it? Well, some cryptid believers cite that it was a Sasquatch, or perhaps a wild man, while others point to it being a hoax, which newspapers weren't opposed to doing back then. Heck, there were not even any local newspapers in Texas that covered this event. It seemed to mainly appear in newspapers of just a couple big cities on the coast, meaning that it was most likely a hoax to increase sales. The Alabama Stone. In 1824, 58-year-old Silas Dinsmore, a businessman and city planner living in Mobile, would send a strange artifact known as the Alabama Stone to the American Antiquarian Society located in Massachusetts. This was a society that many of the nation's leading men were part of, including President James Monroe, so it was pretty common for people to send any kind of special artifact there in hopes of being made a member themselves. In fact, the first governor of the Mississippi Territory, a man from Massachusetts, sent the society one of its first treasures, an ancient stone called the Natchez Idol. But back to the Alabama Stone, Dinsmore, who was certainly hoping to become a member of the society, would ship a tear-shaped slab of sandstone 21.5 inches by 18 inches. This mysterious stone had a crooked inscription in Latin that translated to King of Spain and the Indies. Underneath that was the strangely formed numbers 1232. Dinsmore had gotten the rock from a man named Levin Powell, Tuscaloosa's first tax collector, who claimed a 17-year-old boy named Thomas Scales and his father found it in 1817, when the two were clearing land where the Big Creek enters the Black Warrior River. They said it was partially buried at the foot of a tulip tree. Powell, the tax collector, had set it outside his office as a curiosity for visitors. This has long led to speculation that it's one of the earliest pieces of evidence of European exploration of America, that of Hernando de Soto's expedition in 1539. Hardly any evidence from that expedition has ever been found, except for a few bells found at Indian sites. But what about the number 1232? One argument for that number is that it was a simple mistake and should have read 1532, or possibly that it could have been some kind of distance measurement they used making the journey from Tampa. However, some have argued that it really came from the Spanish colonial activity in the 1780s, where the stone may have been a territory marker because it was located exactly 1,232 furlongs, or about 155 miles, upriver from a Spanish fort. But even that is just a wild guess, as no one knows for sure if this stone is even legit, and if it is, when and where it exactly came from. Cyclops of the Bayou, Louisiana. This one is pretty crazy, and the details are scarce, but I'll try to fill in the gaps the best I can. On a night in 1957, what time of the year I could not find, but it was around 9 p.m., 4 friends, who wished to remain anonymous, were driving around in Louisiana. They would cross a bridge that I could only find named as Tangipahoa River Bridge, yet I couldn't find out what town that was in. Regardless, this took place in the Bayou. These 4 friends had just seen a movie and then finished up by going to have dinner. Now, here they were, just driving around talking and hanging out. After they crossed the bridge, they come up on a smaller bridge, and here's where things got weird. As they got closer, they would notice to the passenger side of the car a person walking out of the ditch. The first thing they noticed was this person's immense height, which gave off the resemblance of a giant. There was also something about this giant that just didn't feel right. Something was off, so the group waited until they reached the next stop, and they turned around and took the highway back to where they saw this humanoid. Once they got back to the area, they turned back around to drive towards that same ditch. They would then see the giant still standing there, and I assume there wasn't much traffic that night, because they would actually stop their car in the middle of the road, but not before setting it at an angle to get their headlights out over the ditch. What they seen was this man that was roughly 7.5 feet tall and was described as hefty, around 325 pounds. He was wearing a pair of pants and a very dark bluish shirt, which seemed to be in very poor condition. They were unable to see if the man was wearing shoes, however. They at first thought this was a homeless man who was just really freakishly tall, but what they seen next spooked them. The man's face was disfigured. His nose looked like that of a snout, and he had one eye that was located off-center on his forehead. The man, who must have also been weirded out by these people gawking at him, walked back down the ditch and into the woods. The 4 friends sped off, thinking they had just seen a Cyclops. Actually, these 4 individuals were so shook up that they went to the nearest police station to report what they had seen. The officers, understandably, did not take a word of it seriously. So, just what did these people see? Well, if the story is true, and that's a big if, it's possible that this was just a person with a deformity who chooses to come out late because he's self-conscious about it, and he basically just lives a secret life. The 4 witnesses who had seen him would actually state later that that was their belief. Although, these 4 friends all lived within that little area where the sighting was, and they reportedly never seen him again. Others have suggested that this man was instead a true Cyclops, while others cite that the whole story is probably just a hoax by 4 bored friends. Johnny Rush Bowman, Virginia, August 19th, 1984. Johnny Bowman of Manassas, Virginia, would be awoken and startled to hear the doorbell ringing at 4:15 a.m. in the morning. After Bowman went down and opened the door, he would be viciously attacked. The attack was so loud that it woke his 2-year-old up from her sleep, but Bowman fought back, and maybe now is a good time to point out, Johnny Rush Bowman was a Virginia state trooper, making this attack all the more odd, because most people would typically not open the door for anyone that hour of the morning, and most people think that a police officer would at least take his sidearm before opening the door. But Johnny didn't. He did fight back, however, but he would die after being stabbed 45 times. His chest was punctured. He also received wounds to the neck, face, stomach, and shoulder, and some on his back as well. Whoever did it did so in a frenzy, continued to stab him while he laid on the ground. The start of the investigation probably didn't go as well as it could have. It was 1984, and crime scene analysis was very different, and it's possible crucial evidence wasn't collected. Bowman's wife, Terry Lee, would give her telling of the events, stating that Johnny was awakened by the doorbell ringing repeatedly. Johnny went downstairs to open the door. After unlocking it, the killer would use an obscenity and then state, quote, "I'm from the power company," end quote, and then started stabbing him over the next 3 minutes with what police believed was a 4-inch blade. Terry would then call 911 twice, telling police her husband was being assaulted, but she could not see the killer because it was too dark. Johnny's brother, who, with his wife, were spending the weekend there, would tell police that he came to the head of the stairs and saw the killer leaving the house, and he chased him, and they grappled briefly. However, investigators recovered a plastic construction hard hat, a cheap brown curly wig, and a pair of tinted sunglasses that the killer most likely wore. As far as theories go, there was one strange one offered up, and I don't know if it was just a product of the 80s or what. The detective stated that the murder was characteristic of a homosexual killing. I'm not sure how they meant that, but they also stated it could have been over a dispute touched off by sudden rage. But they did clarify that they had no evidence for either scenario. They would then later theorize that the murder could have been brought on by drugs or a mentally ill person, while others thought that it was someone that feared Bowman, knew harmful information about him, but they really couldn't even agree to if the murder was random or if they knew Bowman. However, by 1986, the picture began to clear up, and police stated they were 99% sure who was behind the murder. Several sources named this man as fellow state trooper Perry Worrell, and it was over some personal problems involving Worrell, Bowman, and Bowman's wife, Terry. And apparently, according to detectives, he had been a suspect since basically the beginning. Unfortunately, they never had enough evidence to take it to trial, and he quit the force not long after this, and he would die in 2015, denying that he was ever involved, leaving the mystery still unsolved. Jennifer Wyant, Tennessee. On Saturday, June 28, 1980, 21-year-old Jennifer Wyant of Nashville, Tennessee, would attend a softball party before returning back to her apartment to turn in for the night, as she usually attended church on Sunday mornings. However, Jennifer did not make it in the next morning to attend service with her parents, but her parents weren't really that alarmed and just assumed that she had slept in. The following day, though, Jennifer did not show up for work either, and when her parents found out, they tried to get a hold of her, and when Jennifer didn't answer, they knew something was wrong. They would go straight to the police and file a missing persons report. Detectives would begin to retrace her steps in hopes of finding the young woman. They would first go to her apartment and searched it, only to find that it was undisturbed. Outside in the parking lot, her black Trans Am set, and it too was completely undisturbed. They were able to eventually confirm that she had attended the softball party, and she did return back. Yet, it looked like no struggle had taken place. But they would go to interview the neighbors, and this is where things took a dark turn. Multiple neighbors would tell investigators that they had heard screaming that night, that some of them even looked out the window to see 4 people forcing a woman into a dark 4-door sedan. However, these neighbors didn't bother to call the police. Instead, they told the apartment's security guard. This was only the beginning of a couple of terrible decisions that night, because not only did none of these neighbors call the police, but the security guard, he didn't notify the police either. It would be another 5 months until detectives got their first big break. That was on December 11th, when they found Jennifer's driver's license 15 miles away from her apartment. It was found at a site where a housing complex was under construction. Police dogs were brought in, but could not pick up the scent of Jennifer. The case after this went ice cold. Fast forward to 2021, and we would get the first update about the case in nearly 40 years. An ABC affiliate would publish a piece about the case and revealed that Jennifer never made it back into her apartment. Instead, she got ambushed in the parking lot when she returned back from softball. Detectives could never get a for sure motive about why she was abducted, only saying she was targeted, and over 4 decades later, there's still no resolution. Even with several witnesses, even though 4 people were involved, nothing, no closure. Bighoot, West Virginia. And yes, I said Bighoot, not Bigfoot. Bighoot is a name coined by cryptozoologist Mark Hall for a species of owl believed to have been encountered in the woods of West Virginia and across the Ohio Valley. The bird is much bigger than the regular owl, reaching alleged heights of 5 feet tall, while some more legendary tales have cited seeing the owl being able to fly away with people. Some have even tried to claim this cryptid might actually be a prehistoric owl thought to be extinct, called Ornamengalonyx, which grew to be about 3.5 feet in height. And while you may not find a giant owl cryptid to be especially interesting, there's actually a little bit more to this story. What if all the Mothman sightings in West Virginia from November 1966 to December 1967 were really just this giant owl? Now I know it's blasphemy to West Virginians to hear that the Mothman might not be real, but this theory actually makes a lot of sense. And it's not just the Mothman. The giant owl could explain other cryptids too, like Birdman, which was said to be a giant red bird with the head of a man, sorta like Mothman, and apparently like to chase cars. There's also the Thunderbird cryptids, which we discussed previously. A giant owl would also explain these, and even in certain situations, seeing red eyes setting up about 8 feet high that could be mistaken for a Sasquatch in reality, is nothing more than a huge owl perched up on a limb. There's even Native American legends about these creatures called flying heads, which were just that, giant flying heads with claws, again, which sounds suspiciously close to a giant owl. But the most important of Hall's theory was that of the giant owl being Mothman. A lot of the weird reports for Mothman cite no head, but eyes embedded into its chest. Considering an owl's small rounded head seems to sit right atop of its roundish body, it appears that it has no neck, and in flight, it could look like a headless winged figure, or maybe even a large flying head, especially in the dark. Owls also give off a red eye shine when light hits them, and that's supposed to be the Mothman's most striking feature, its shining red eyes. Finally is the wingspan. Mothman's is supposed to be around 10 feet, which would just be ginormous for an owl, which gets us back to this cryptid. Could it be that there is an undiscovered species of giant owl, thus making it a cryptid, flying around in West Virginia? It's very conceivable. Hall would also report on a sighting from 1982 from a woman in southwest Ohio, where she swore that she could see a tree moving, and it startled her, so she watched it closely, and then seen that the tree flexed its wings, which was about the size of a small airplane. It was then that she noticed that it was actually just a huge owl. She also made note of the creature's giant 3 claws, the same type of claws that the Mothman is supposed to have. Although skeptics point out, if Bighoot exists, remains would have been found. Still, I think after all the cryptids we have covered, I have to believe that this one has the best chance of actually existing. The Phantom Whistler, Louisiana, February 1950, in Paradise, Louisiana. 18-year-old Jacqueline Cadeau would become the victim of a bizarre harassment campaign. It all started with what Jacqueline would describe as hearing wolf whistles outside her window at the home she shared with her mother. This went on several times over a period of time, and the women would often look out and could never find anyone making the noise, and that's because it's believed he had hid somewhere in the shrubbery. But it began to escalate, because their house would eventually be broken into as well, and although they couldn't prove it, they pretty much assumed whoever was doing the whistling also broke in. This is already creepy and weird enough on its own, but it got worse, because Jacqueline would end up announcing her engagement to a state trooper named Herbert Belsom, and the whistler did not like this. Now, he started to whistle the notes to the funeral march and then ending with a blood-curdling moan before fleeing from her yard and disappearing into the night. And not surprisingly, the Cadeau family started to get concerned, especially after someone began to make threatening phone calls to the home, one in which a man told Jacqueline's mother if she married Herbert, he would stick a knife in her, and then saying, "Your daughter will never marry him, I'm going to kill her." This obviously grabbed the attention of the newspapers, and one reporter would actually go to their home, and he too would hear the whistler. It was not long after this that Jacqueline had a nervous breakdown. As far as who the man was, he was only spotted one time, and that's when Jacqueline's mother seen a stocky man with matted hair fleeing across the lawn. Law enforcement was stumped as well. Despite searching the yard several times, they could never find a clue of the man. Jacqueline would eventually move in with her fiance's parents for a while, and when she did, the whistler would call Jacqueline's mother and state, quote, "Tell Jackie I know she's at Herbert's house," end quote. It was like she couldn't get away from this weirdo. Eventually, Jacqueline and Herbert got married, despite fears that this man would show up and attack. Yet, nothing happened. And then, the harassment stopped. Just like that. And ever since, the question remains, just who was this guy? The sheriff initially told reporters that the whole thing was a hoax, yet later went back on this because he announced an arrest had been made in the case. Yet, he would never release this person's name because he said he didn't want to embarrass the persons involved, which is kinda odd, and since no charges were filed, the person could legally remain anonymous. Theories would range over the years, with some claiming that it was a paranormal event, that she was haunted by a ghost, but there seems to be a more down-to-earth theory, which was the sheriff did not want to embarrass this person behind it because these persons were the Cadeau family, and the whole thing was done just to get attention. He would eventually call it an inside job. However, others still claim it was the work of an unknown prankster that the sheriff either could not catch or did catch and just told the person to knock it off. Elizabeth Gill, Missouri. On June 13, 1965, 2-year-old Beth Gill of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was at home with one of her siblings while her mother was traveling back home from Chicago. Her father was also out of town for work at this time, and in a nightmare scenario around 4 p.m., it was realized that Beth had disappeared from the yard. Her siblings and other neighborhood children began to search for the little girl before one of them went to contact the police. And in what must have been horrifying, Beth's mother would return home to a small crowd of people and the police to hear that her 2-year-old baby was missing. She fainted on the spot, but when she came to, she began searching immediately. The police, for their part, would canvass the entire neighborhood, as well as dragging the Mississippi River, yet nothing came up. The next morning, investigators would begin going around asking questions, and it was then that a mechanic informed police that a couple had brought in a 1965 Chevy truck, which needed to be fixed. However, the mechanic would have to order a part before it could be worked on, and this would take a couple of days. The couple stated they were okay with staying in town until the part arrived, and after a few days, the part would arrive, and the mechanic called the motel where this mysterious couple were staying and found out from the motel clerk that they had checked out the day before. It would be later when the mechanic heard about Elizabeth's disappearance around 4 p.m. that he realized that was when the couple had checked out. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? Well, investigators would actually go to this motel to check on this couple and found that the people who had rented the room had a long history of using fake names and switching license plates, even doing so in town, leading investigators to believe they were involved in some criminal activities. They were known to be drifters that traveled around the region selling purses, and it wasn't just 2 people. It was a husband and wife in their 60s, plus their daughter and her husband that had rented the room, and Beth's mom and brother actually seen this woman talking to Beth near her car just days before. These 4 individuals, whoever they really were, became the top suspects almost immediately. Investigators were eventually able to track the vehicle back to a dealership in Lake Orion, Michigan, but that's as far as they could get. Plus, the case now went over state lines, and the police would have to contact the FBI. But sadly, the FBI claimed since there was no clear evidence of a kidnapping, they could not intervene, and all they could do was list Elizabeth as a missing person. It would be almost 50 years later before the FBI finally reopened and reclassified the case as kidnapping. Authorities did reveal they interviewed an elderly woman about the case, but she was reluctant to discuss what she knew, but mentioned 2 members of her own family were involved in the investigation. The 4 travelers are most likely behind the abduction, and detectives feel that either the younger woman traveling with them wanted Beth as a child of her own, or they knew a couple that wanted one. Regardless, these people were never identified, and Beth's fate is still unsolved. Smurfette, Texas. This next one could be disturbing for some viewers, so I'll give you a few seconds to skip ahead if you choose. On October 16, 2012, in Houston, Texas, a driver going through a road that was heavily trafficked would pull off to the side. Usually, that is not something that would be done here, but this driver had lost a hubcap. As the driver was looking for it, he came up on a gated gravel driveway leading to a private oil field sitting about 20 feet from a fork in the road. Laying here was discarded trash and some black plastic garbage bags. Getting the better of this driver's curiosity, he would take a peek and discover human remains that had been double bagged and had skeletonized. Of course, the horrified man called authorities, who come to the scene and started their investigation. After sending the body back for an autopsy, it was determined that the deceased was a female between 15 and 17 years old, likely mixed race of African American and Caucasian. She had long curly dark brown hair that was held back from her face with a bobby pin. She was fully clothed with a distinct blue-green shirt bearing an image of the cartoon character Smurfette. And while this is sad enough on its own, what they found next was even more disturbing. Under this Smurfette shirt and cargo pants, she was wearing lingerie, consisting of pink underpants and a black bra. Detectives assumed that, along with the age and childish outfit, she was probably trafficked, especially considering she was found in an area known as a hub for brothels, and since a contributing factor that leads to trafficking is family estrangement, It could be why this girl was never reported missing or why she has not been identified. As for the cause of death, the medical examiner couldn't be sure because of decomposition. However, he was strongly thought that foul play was involved, and it was also thought that this girl had been impoverished or in ill health prior to her death. Her bones showed signs of malnutrition during her childhood, along with having only 22 ribs instead of 24. She also had a very small body frame, probably stood between 4'7" and 5 feet tall, which was caused by some kind of illness or syndrome. She also had dental work at some point of her life, but this must have stopped because she had suffered heavy tooth decay before dying. They also eventually determined she was not from Houston, and more likely came from South Texas, possibly San Antonio or Austin. It's also possible that the girl's relatives are not from the US. As far as theories go, some suggest that it had nothing to do with trafficking and possibly was a disabled child that was neglected and or slipped through the cracks of the system, possibly a foster family that didn't take care of her. It's really hard to say for sure. Although the girl was taken care of at some point in her life, she later became neglected and seemed to live in abject poverty. The search for her identity is ongoing. Aurora UFO crash, Texas. We stay in Texas for this next paranormal mystery, that which occurred on April 17, 1897. But before we go into that, I need to point out the 1897 mystery airship phenomenon is something we might discuss more in depth in the future. But basically, this was a year where thousands of people across the US allegedly observed these mysterious airships going to and fro. The pilots flying them are allegedly unknown, and these airships are kind of like the predecessors to UFOs. This next account is about one of the more famous stories from that time. The source of this comes from the Dallas Morning News, and it cited that a farm in Aurora, Texas, where an airship suddenly appeared over it about 6 a.m. It was said to be much closer to Earth than any of the others before, and according to the witnesses, the airship's machinery must have not been working correctly because it was out of control and ran into the tower of a windmill which belonged to the judge named J.S. Proctor. When the ship collided, it suffered a huge explosion and scattered into debris over several acres. When people on the ground rushed to look for survivors, they found one deceased pilot, who they assumed was the only occupant. However, witnesses would report his remains indicated that, quote, he was not an inhabitant of this world, end quote. The journalist of this article, S.C. Hayden, would then cite a man named T.J. Weems, who was said to be the United States Signal Service officer of that area, which is kind of like the guy in charge of communications for the Army, and he was also said to be an authority on astronomy, and it would be him that claimed that the deceased pilot was a native of Mars. How he knew this is unexplained, but it seems that the local citizens held T.J. Weems in high regard. They then found papers on the alien being, which contained writings in some unknown hieroglyphics, which appeared to document the pilot's travels. It was also noted his ship was made from an unknown metal. Finally, and most bizarre of all, they actually had a funeral for the alien and allegedly buried him in the Aurora cemetery. The wreckage was then dumped into a well under the windmill, and some was buried with the pilot. A headstone was even placed there, allegedly, but it was discovered that it had been stolen when Time magazine decided to do an article on the incident in 1979, and they noted that the whole story at the time that it came out was ridiculed and that no one back then believed it, neither do the citizens there today. They even found one citizen that was alive when the article came out, and she claimed that the whole thing was written as a joke to bring interest to Aurora because the town was dying. She also noted that Judge Proctor didn't even own a windmill. It should be noted here though, this girl would have been 4 years old during these events, so her account is in question. And there were also 2 other witnesses that were found later on that contradicted her, one stating that he saw the smoking craft before it crashed, while another cited actually seeing the wreckage. It's thought now that the whole thing was probably a hoax. Researchers even tested water in the well that the wreckage was supposed to be thrown into, and found nothing odd about it. However, the owner of the home in 1935 claimed to have cleared the wreckage out of the well, which might be why nothing was found in tests later on. Defenders of the story also point out that there were a ton of sightings in the surrounding states and country around this same time. They also point to metal that had been dug out of nearby trees as proof of an explosion. Finally, an alternate theory is that it was an early airship that was being tested, and the pilot's body was unrecognizable given the appearance that he was an alien. Erwin Rommel in Tennessee? If you don't know who Erwin Rommel is, I will try to give you a brief summary. He's known better as the Desert Fox, probably the best German field marshal of World War II. Although known mostly for his leadership of German and Italian forces in northern Africa, he also participated in the 1940 invasion of France. He was actually respected by his British adversaries as well, and had a reputation for chivalry, where he coined the phrase, "war without hate," and he refused to conduct war like the other Nazi commanders. Instead, he didn't participate in war crimes and abuses, although some have stated this was just a myth. He also wrote a classic book called Infantry Attacks about military tactics that detailed the use of shock troops, speed, deception, and deep penetration into enemy territory to surprise and overwhelm the enemy. The book was so important that even other Western generals, such as George Patton, studied it. In short, the man was a military genius. Which gets us to our mystery. Did Erwin Rommel travel through the state of Tennessee between World War I and World War II, looking at Civil War battlefields? If so, why? This has long been a rumor in the state of Tennessee. According to the legend, Rommel came to America for one reason: to study Confederate cavalry tactics, particularly that of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, a controversial man in his own right, one of the few soldiers to enlist as a private and be promoted to general without any prior military training. His expertise as a cavalry leader led to him being given command of his own corps, where he established new doctrines for mobile forces. He liked to use mounted infantry and often deployed artillery as the lead in a battle, revolutionizing cavalry tactics. Although it has been said he was probably too far ahead of his time because the Confederacy really didn't realize what they had or the scope of what he was doing. And so it was here that Rommel, on his motorcycle, drove across the vast Tennessee countryside, learning as much about General Forrest and the Civil War battles that he could. Or did he? Well, there were numerous sightings and stories of people interacting with him. Allegedly, a State Department official during the 1920s acted as his tour guide in Virginia. He even stopped to give a lecture at Lee Chapel. Today, it's still said that at a hotel in Clifton, Tennessee, there is a register with Rommel's signature on it, as he had visited the area to see where General Forrest made a river crossing. He even stopped to meet Thomas Stribling, the author best known for writing the Vading trilogy. The two sat on Stribling's porch discussing the Civil War, and it's here that Mrs. Stribling would even comment at how dashing the Desert Fox was and how the local girls loved him, while the Russ Hotel would put a plaque on the door to the room that Rommel had stayed in, labeling it as the Rommel Room. But maybe the most important witness accounts were from the people who seen him traveling on a motorcycle, because in this poor rural area of Tennessee, these people had never seen a motorcycle. So the image of Rommel with those pants and knee-high boots as he tore through the Tennessee countryside on this motorcycle was burned into their memory. But here's the issue: Rommel was never in Tennessee, at least according to his wife and children, and well, numerous authors and historians. He never even went to the US, period. So just who did all these people witness? That's hard to say, but it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that the Germans did send someone from the military to Tennessee in the 1920s to scout old battlefields and tactics, maybe in preparation for the war they would conduct in the 30s. If they did, they don't have a record of who that was, leaving some to wonder, could this whole thing have been the Mandela effect? Regina, Armstrong, Florida, June 18, 1985. A man named Bob Armstrong would take his two daughters, Regina and Christina, and drop them off at the babysitter's apartment in southeast Orlando. They would both hug and kiss him before he went off to work. As sometime after lunch, the two girls, along with their babysitter's young son, would head outside to play. As they were jumping and running around the courtyard in front of the apartment, a man approached them around noon before walking off. However, he would come back shortly and spoke to the children again. This time, he would offer Christina and the young boy $2 each to stand watch at a nearby apartment which he claimed belonged to him and his wife. He then told them he was taking Regina with him to pick up his grandchildren and would be back in half an hour. And of course, that's pretty ominous. And when the two didn't return, Regina's sister Christina began to worry. It dawned on her that something awful could have happened to her little sister. She, along with the babysitter's son, rushed back to the apartment where she tried to explain what happened. Unfortunately, the babysitter locked the bedroom door and ignored her, thinking she was playing around and being dramatic. It would be a full 2 hours later, when the babysitter's boyfriend showed up, that Christina finally got to tell the babysitter the whole story. It was then that police were finally called, and they did door-to-door searches. They even took horses up to the wooded areas, brought sniffer dogs out, took a helicopter, but found nothing. A week later, 100 Navy cadets joined the search in what became the largest manhunt in Orlando history. A composite sketch of the abductor was also created. The man was white, 6 foot, medium build, and dark hair. He was between 37 and 40 years old, wearing a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and a gold watch with Roman numerals. His upper lip had been split as if he had recently been in a fight. He was also missing 2 teeth on one side of his mouth, and he had a tattoo on his left forearm, and he smelled oily, like he was a mechanic. Christina also noted he reeked of alcohol. After the sketch started making its way around, a 7-year-old girl from Cocoa Beach, about 60 miles away, would tell her father that this was the same man who tried just days before to abduct her. Apparently, he crept into her room after prying the window screen open and unlocking her bedroom door. He then tried to lift her out the window, but her older sister woke up and began screaming, alerting her parents, and the man ran off. Thousands of tips poured in, and one in particular was from an assistant manager at Popeye's. Apparently, a man came in that looked exactly like the sketch, and he asked the cashier to open a can of ravioli he had brought with him. The cashier then glanced at a sketch hanging up, and then back to the man, and realized it was him. This man ran out of the restaurant and to his brown car, where he sped off. The cashier called police, and they said the story was legit, because Regina's favorite food was ravioli. There would be numerous sightings over the next year, but none of them panned out. Finally, a skull and dress were discovered at a construction site. Crazily enough, police didn't make the connection and put it in an evidence locker and forgot about it. It wasn't until a new police chief took over that a connection was made to Regina, and the dress was identified by the father. Apparently, the last police chief, who had gotten fired, just threw it in the locker and didn't notify anyone. The case went completely cold, and outside of the one suspect on death row, whom they eventually ruled out, no person of interest was ever named, and close to 4 decades later, Regina's murder is still unsolved. The Mad Gasser of Botetourt County, Virginia, December 3rd, 1933, at the Cal Huffman family home in Haymaker Town, Virginia. Mrs. Huffman was getting ready for bed when she started to smell something strange, and whatever it was, it made her nauseous. The smell soon disappeared, and she thought nothing else of it. So she, along with her children, would lay down for bed. But 30 minutes later, the foul odor returned. This time, Mr. Huffman was suspicious enough to walk over to a neighbor's to use the phone to call the police. They arrived shortly, but they could not determine the source of the smell, and it disappeared by midnight anyways. But it would happen again. This time, an hour later, around 1 a.m., the mysterious gas appeared, and all 8 family members were affected. They suffered from nausea, headache, and had a hard time breathing. The worst was their 20-year-old daughter. A doctor had to give her CPR. Mr. Huffman suspected the family had been attacked, especially after a neighbor told him he had seen a shadowy figure running away from the house. The police, along with the doctor, would go back out to inspect, and the doctor was able to rule out ether, chloroform, and tear gas, but he could not identify what had been used. The police, following the tips about an alleged prowler, would actually find something interesting beneath the window at the Huffman family home, and that was a woman's high-heel shoe print. And although police were now involved, the game was just now starting. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, another family was attacked, with the symptoms ranging from nausea, burning eyes, and weakness. It occurred about 9 p.m. when Clarence Hall, his wife, and 2 children came home, and 5 minutes later, they smelled a strange odor. Clarence got so weak he began to stagger, forcing his wife to drag him outside. The police with a doctor were again called, and this time, he noted that it had a sweet taste, with a trace of formaldehyde. Police also found a nail that had been pulled from a window, and a neighbor had seen someone with a flashlight near their home. A reward of $500, or about $12,000 now, was posted for information leading to the arrest of the mad gasser, but attacks continued. From January 10th to January 23rd, there were at least 7 attacks, and again, in one of these, police found a woman's shoe print. But things were now reaching a boiling point. Local men were patrolling the roads armed with guns. Police feared that an innocent person may get shot just because of the town's nervousness. The next day, the Virginia State Assembly voted to pass a bill calling for a 10-year prison term sentence for anyone convicted of releasing noxious gases in public or private. I'll let you make your own joke there. But the attacks continued. On the 25th, the mad gasser almost met his end as a pet dog woke resident Chester Snyder, who ran outside and fired a shot off at a man fleeing, but he missed. And just days after this, a lot of the citizens of town started to wonder if this whole thing was just mass hysteria. In fact, one of the doctors helping police investigate admitted that while a few of the cases were real, the majority were just people's imagination. The last official attack came on February 3rd, which left the whole family severely ill, and it was ruled that it was a legit attack. However, other attacks occurred after this, even spreading out into other counties, but these were all dismissed. And finally, the authorities would release a statement saying the mad gasser never existed, and it was all caused by normal events, which then led to mass hysteria, although several police officers disagreed with that sentiment. Off the record, of course. Most investigators that have looked into this case now believe most of the attacks can be disregarded, but a few were real, and just who was behind those attacks and why they did it has never been solved. Monique Smith, Louisiana. Between the years of 2015 and 2016, Monique Smith and her husband, Justin Sims, and their 3 children would move to New Orleans. The home was located in what is described as one of the good areas of the Gentilly neighborhood. It is here that the neighbors would describe the family as very nice and very quiet, although the kids were often spotted outside playing, or the family would have a barbecue. At some point, this kind of slacked off, and hardly anyone from the home was ever seen. After some time, Justin and Monique would split up, and he would move out of the family home. Fast forward until 2017, on March 9th. The now 30-year-old Monique was making plans for the following day, which was set to be very busy, as Monique planned to go car shopping and then help her mother move in with her and her kids. But early that next morning, at 4:18 a.m., a tragedy would unwind that would erase all these plans. As the family lay down to sleep, someone would break into the back door of Monique's home. This intruder would sneak into Monique's room and calmly shoot her in the face multiple times, killing her instantly. But the cold-blooded killer wasn't finished. He then made his way upstairs, where he found the 3 children, the daughter and the eldest child, 12-year-old Amia, the middle child, 10-year-old Justin, and 6-year-old Jumran. The man would raise his gun and shoot all 3 children in the face and walked out, leaving them for dead. However, what he did not know was one of the victims was still clinging to life. That was 12-year-old Amia, who, in spite of being shot in the face, was able to call 911. An ambulance arrived shortly and took her to the hospital for emergency surgery. Police searched the rest of the home to find everyone else deceased, all from multiple gunshot wounds to the face. DNA and other evidence was recovered from the home, but police have not elaborated on it. A sketch was also made of the suspect, which you can see here. The news spread quickly and a crowd formed outside the home, and before long, Monique's ex, Justin, would hear the news, and obviously rumors and suspicion fell on him. But Justin was 3 hours away at the time of the murder, working an early shift job, and police were able to confirm that. As far as theories go, or suspects for that matter, there's not many. The lead detective has stated the murder was a targeted hit, citing that nothing was stolen, and he also believes that the children were killed because they knew the suspect, or at least were familiar enough with him to identify him. Police looked into Monique's personal life and found that she was not dating anyone at the time. There's also speculation that I found that insinuated that the murder could have been a payback for a drug debt owed by her ex, Justin. but that seems to be just speculation. And to this day, no one knows what prompted the massacre, and the police have remained tight-lipped. Ruth Dorsey, Alabama. Ruth Dorsey, who lived in Opelika, Alabama, was the typical southern small-town woman. She played organ and taught Sunday school, and lived on a farm with her husband. But in 1965, after almost 4 decades of marriage, her husband would pass away, and Ruth, she was childless, but was very close to her nieces and nephews, who were numerous, and the extended family. They all worried about Ruth, living by herself so isolated, outside of her huge 350-acre farm. The nearest neighbors were a mile away, yet Ruth liked the independence that it brought. It also kept her active, which she loved. However, on August 17, 1974, the now 67-year-old Ruth began her Saturday. She started with doing laundry and making some banana pudding for neighbors. She also made a vet appointment for one of her dogs. She then, most likely, studied her Bible lesson for the next day, as well as practicing her piano selections. And around 4:30 that afternoon, she stopped to get gas. And we know this because she told one of the attendants she had received a phone call from a relative and she now needed to go pick this person up. Who this person was on this call has never been publicly revealed. At 6 p.m., a neighbor would then see her turn into her driveway and make the drive up the long and winding road back to her home, which was not viewable from the main road. The next morning, though, Ruth did not arrive at church, and her fellow church members took note and called the police asking for a wellness check. The police would then make the drive over to her home, but when they got there, they found the side door unlocked and the front door was wide open, which was certainly odd. The home was tidy though, and nothing appeared to be missing. Ruth's Bible and unfinished lesson plans still sat on the dining room table. Laundry was hanging up outside on the clothesline. Police then walked around the home, looking for anything odd, and they eventually found Ruth's dogs in the bathroom. Some sources say they were locked in there. Regardless, the dogs were visibly shaken up, but that was the only clue found. Later that day, Ruth's car was found downtown in front of a duplex where she and her husband lived right after they had gotten married. The door to that residence was also wide open, but nothing indicated that Ruth had been there. The keys to the car were still in the ignition, and Ruth's glasses and purse, which contained her credit cards and $11, lay in the front seat. Fingerprints from the car were too smudged to collect. The police would then go back and search the entire farm and found no trace of her. Even the FBI was brought in, but nothing was found. It seemed that there probably was foul play involved, as the odds of her just up and leaving were slim. But who in the world would harm this elderly woman who was seemingly loved by many people? It's one of the creepiest disappearances I've found. No sign of a struggle, but her dogs were traumatized. Her car was found at her old residence. The unnamed relative that called, it's all bizarre. There wasn't many theories either. The sheriff originally tried to convince the family that Ruth had left on her own with a love interest, but that doesn't seem likely, and the family suspected foul play. Others have speculated that Ruth may have been in the early stages of dementia, but to everyone that knew her, she showed no symptoms. Armstrong Mountain Mystery Walls, West Virginia. Along a stretch of the US 60 highway near Boomer, West Virginia, sits a historic marker which reads, Ancient Works. On a ridge between Armstrong and Loop Creeks, across the river, are extensive prehistoric stone ruins, whose walls are several miles long and enclose a large area. Many of these stones are from the valley below the old wall. These walls, a total of 6 of them, and between 2 to 4 feet high and 20 feet wide at some locations, are mired in legend, but they are very real. However, the exact reason they were built and who built them is a mystery. The Mount Carbon stone walls are located in the coal-bearing mountains of the southern part of the state. It was here that coal miners would speculate at their origins, and sadly, it's these same miners that over the last 200 years probably carried off important relics, as numerous archaeologists have pointed out. The location of these walls is odd to begin with, as they sit high in the mountains and it takes a considerable hike to get to them. The land is also rugged, with the walls running over steep hillsides and tangled between old trees. The first documented account of these walls comes from 1818, when the first permanent settlers came into the area. They would note that they were about 6 to 7 feet high. That was pretty much it though. There was no interest in them until over a century later, when archaeologists would actually go in to start studying the walls. The northern tip starts about a mile south of Armstrong Creek and then extends southward for about 4 miles. The 4 walls, which are kind of shaped like horseshoes, are probably best described as crude rows of loosely piled rock. In the years since the studies began, archaeologists have come down to one theory, and that is the walls were almost certainly used for ceremonial purposes because they were just not well suited for defense, as they were not that high. Secondly, it was probably not used as any type of animal pen, since this land was too rugged for this. Further confusing about this archaeological site is no pottery has ever been found. Actually, anything that would be found at most prehistoric sites has never been found here. Actually, very little of the walls even remains today, except for a few piles of rock, and part of that is due to the fact that it was destroyed in the 60s by strip mining, although the coal company had denied this, claiming they couldn't even find the site. They later stated to have mistakenly destroyed 3 of the walls, claiming they did not know what they were. The local Native Americans in the area have always stated that this site existed before they arrived, again bringing back speculation of the Moon-Eyed people's role in this area, but no one knows for sure exactly how old the walls are, and estimates are as wide-ranging as 8000 BC to 800 AD. 1977 Flora UFO sighting, Mississippi. I try not to put a lot of UFO cases on this iceberg because those mysteries usually just come down to witness accounts, which are notoriously shaky, but I include this one specifically because of the witnesses, and one of these is a deputy for the Madison County Sheriff's Department in Flora, Mississippi. According to this deputy, who asked for his identity to remain anonymous, him, along with 24 other law enforcement officers, witnessed a giant floating object above a tree line in a cotton field off of a country road. He stated that it was about 15 to 18 feet off the ground, blue in color, like a metallic blue, with portholes in the center of it. Another deputy, who actually spoke on the record about it, Kenny Creel, gave his description of the events, which made the encounter headline news. It was Kenny, along with Constable James Luke, who first spotted the craft when they were on routine patrol, and they noted that it hovered above the car about 20 to 30 feet. And it's here where this story divulges, because shortly after the events, Kenny Creel would tell people that he made the whole thing up, and that it was a joke by the police. Yet, the anonymous deputy, whose story I told first, has contradicted this, and he has stated that Kenny was threatened by government spooks, who told him to not speak about the UFO again. But that's not the only proof for this. There's also the fact that several other non-law enforcement witnesses seen the craft that night, which kind of makes it seem like something was definitely in the air, but what? That explanation would eventually be given as a weather balloon. However, some believe the whole thing was just a hoax, or that the government came in and hushed the whole thing up. Pauline George, Tennessee, March 7th, 1991. 50-year-old Pauline George would leave her job at a local hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, and arrived home about 2:30 p.m. It was then Pauline started to get ready for her date, which was set for 5 p.m. She showered, went through her mail, and then put on a housecoat. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Pauline's boyfriend, Jack Lane, would arrive to the home. It was here he was immediately struck by something odd. Pauline did not come to the door, so Jack went around to the back to knock, and realized the door was ajar. Jack would step in and look for Pauline, but when he started to walk down to the basement, he spotted her body in a side room. There was blood everywhere. Jack, who was a retired firefighter, knew instantly that Pauline was deceased, and he started backing out of the room the way he came in before calling police. An autopsy found that her attacker had slashed her throat and sliced up her arms as she tried to defend herself. He had also punched her in the face while making multiple stabs all over her before she finally bled to death in the basement. Investigators determined whoever had done this must have had a significant amount of blood on their clothes. Detectives started to look for a motive and found that jewelry was sitting out in the open that had not been stolen, and untouched money still lay on the bed, thus ruling robbery out. Police would take the search from inside the home to outside and even into the surrounding woods. They would question everyone that knew her, up to 70 people, and not one person had anything bad to say. Pauline's next-door neighbors were an elderly couple who had seen Pauline come in, but never saw another vehicle pull up or leave. However, someone else reported seeing a strange green truck in her driveway earlier that day. That driver, Philip Wayne Matthews, had a criminal record of robbery. Detectives did look at him, but there was really no evidence that could lead to an arrest. So they turned to her boyfriend next, and T2 was cleared. And just like that, the case went cold. No robbery, no sign of sexual assault, and this person seemingly got in and out undetected. They didn't even have a blood trail outside the home, making them wonder if he had cleaned up before leaving. One final theory in all this, though, was a set of railroad tracks did run behind Pauline's home, where the back door was ajar. It has been speculated that the killer came in by train and then left the same way. Also, this was the first time DNA was used in Tennessee, but the technology was rudimentary at this point, so it led to nothing. There's not many theories in this one. Some think that it was someone that was close to her. Others think that it could have been a drug addict who knew her from her job at the hospital and broke in thinking she had drugs. Others cite a madman from the train. Mary Mac Ravenel, South Carolina. In 1905, Mary Mac Martin, a widow, would marry a man named John Ravenel, who lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And John Ravenel was rich and well-connected socially. After Mary and him wed, she found herself a leading figure in the high society of Charleston. She was a popular hostess, involved with many charitable and social organizations, and at some point later on, John would pass away, leaving Mary as a widow once again. But she would stay very active within the community. But on November 1st, 1933, that would all change. That night, around 10 p.m., two women were driving past the Ravenel mansion when they were stunned to see the body of a woman slumped on the sidewalk, and that body was the 64-year-old widow, Mary Ravenel. The women got out of the vehicle and rushed to Mary's side, and Mary would tell them a man had hit her. These good Samaritans would then flag down two men that were passing by, and they loaded Mary up into the car to take her to the hospital. They assumed she was the victim of a hit-and-run accident. Mary screamed for them to let her out of the car and said she knew she was going to die because the pain was too much. However, they did make it to the hospital, and the doctors kept asking Mary what had happened, and all she could say was a man hit me. The doctors would then ask Mary, well, was it a car? And she would say she didn't know what it was. So doctors had no idea how to treat her, and by the next morning, she was dead. An autopsy was then done, and the medical examiner found the cause. Mary had been shot with a .38 caliber bullet, which passed through her right forearm and upper arm and into her chest. There were no powder burns, which suggested she was shot at a distance while raising her arm, possibly to ward off a blow. The murder of one of Charleston's leading citizens shocked the community. Pressure was on the police to find the killer. Unfortunately, they had nothing to work with. No motive, no eyewitnesses, no weapon found, no known enemies. Her purse and jewelry lay untouched. She wouldn't or couldn't name the man, or even say how she had been shot. It was then that the detectives settled on an odd theory. One witness had told investigators the night that she was killed, they heard the howling of a cat fight, followed by a gunshot and a woman's scream. It was proposed someone had tried to shoot the cats, but missed and hit Mary instead. Yet, this doesn't explain why she kept saying a man hit her. It also doesn't explain why Mary had her arm up, seemingly in self-defense. There were also several other witnesses that claimed to have heard the sound of someone running away after the gunshot. So could this have been a robbery gone wrong, and the crook accidentally shot her? A $250 reward, or about $6,000 in today's money, was posted for information leading to an arrest, and sadly, that's it to this one. The case went cold and was never solved. Eva DeBrule, South Carolina, June 29th, 1977, in the small town of Rock Hill, South Carolina. 15-year-old Eva DeBrule was outside mowing the lawn. After finishing up, she would walk back into her home and make some iced tea. It was after this she would answer a phone call, whom was her father's employer, asking him to come into work. Mary would relay this message to him, and he would get up and leave for work right after 11 a.m. Meanwhile, Eva's mother remained asleep in bed as she worked the night shift, but she would wake up about an hour later, around noon, and discover that Eva was not around. Walking around the home, she did find a pot of iced tea and a glass that had been undisturbed. There was also a bathtub full of water that had seemingly not been used. The television was still on as well, and the recliner was stretched out as if someone had been watching, and Eva's rubber flip-flops were sitting on the front lawn. The only thing missing were her eyeglasses. The police would soon be alerted, and they started searching around the area and talking to neighbors. One of these was actually Eva's grandmother, who lived near the home, about 40 feet away to be specific, and she stated that on that morning, she saw a late model blue and white, or green and white, Jeep-type vehicle drive up to the DeBrule residence and stop by the door. A man got out, then stood on the porch and appeared to be talking to someone through the screen door. She did not think anything about it, because Eva's father repaired autos and strangers often come by to get work done. However, her grandmother did not know that he had already been called into work. The grandmother then reported that the man drove away and came back about 10 to 15 minutes later, but she didn't notice if he had actually stopped this time, nor did she hear any suspicious noises, or actually even see her granddaughter get into a car. This man has never been identified, and it's not exactly clear if he really had any connection with Eva's disappearance. However, he was described as a white man of medium height and build. Her father would end up finding a Coca-Cola bottle in the yard where the man had pulled up. The bottle said it was made in Georgia, and since the Coca-Cola plant in this area served only South and North Carolina, it was assumed that the man had came from out of state. Yet for whatever reason, the police did not dust the bottle for prints. Henry Lee Lucas, the man who confessed to numerous murders, the majority of which he lied about, confessed to killing Eva, but his confessions really don't mean much. There were no other suspects and no real motives. She was a well-behaved teen who was deeply religious. She kept her family informed about where she was going, and if she intended to leave. She also had no boyfriends and was incredibly shy. It was like she had just vanished from the front yard. Her father would spend the rest of his life looking for her, and hired a private investigator as well. Police, for their part, just didn't have many clues to go by. But hey, maybe they should have dusted that bottle for prints. To be fair, it seems they really did work hard on it, collecting a case file as big as a banker's box. Yet, it never got anywhere, and they suspect foul play led to her murder. Blue Man of the Ozarks, Missouri, 1865. A hunter named Saul Collins was hunting in Douglas County, Missouri. At the time, he was tracking game when he came across some tracks that indicated a bear had been in the area. He would continue to follow these tracks for hours, and they eventually led up a mountainside. As he started making his way up, he was shocked to see a boulder just rolling down the hill directly towards him. Luckily, he was able to jump behind a tree at the last second, narrowly avoiding being hit. He must have thought, what were the odds of that? But it didn't take long until a second boulder went rolling by, and finally a third, which came crashing down into a tree with such force that the rock shattered. Saul could only peer around the tree to see the hillside. A gigantic figure shaped like an immense man, stark naked, except for the skin of some animal around its waist, and other wrapping of skin around its feet. The creature was also covered from head to toe, with a tightly curling coat of short black hair, which, when the sun struck upon it, appeared to be a dark blue hue. Saul would later state that the creature could not be less than 9 feet tall, and it carried a club that was 8 to 10 feet long. And so Saul froze, but this giant would throw one more rock that shattered against a tree, and then let out a scream that echoed through the hills, prompting Saul to flee for his life. Making it back to town, he would get with some neighbors who were determined to track down this wild being. They spent several days in the woods, catching many glimpses of him, but they never actually caught him. Strangely, or maybe not, this was also around the same time that many local farmers reported having many sheep and pigs disappear. Thankfully, after about a week or two of all this, the creature just vanished. But over the next 16 years, it would be spotted sporadically near the river. But between 1890 and 1911, there was not one sighting. But this changed in 1915, as it was spotted once more, this time by several loggers, although some accounts state that it was seen by a farmer looking for lost sheep. His black hair was now gray, and his body was not as robust as 50 years prior, but this creature was still very active. And again, another hunting party went out looking for him, and they actually found his den in a remote valley, but they never actually saw the creature. After this, it was never seen again. The name Blue Man was thought to come from the short bluish-black hair that covered the creature, but there are variations of this telling. Some say that it was not a Sasquatch, and instead was more of a wild man that covered himself with skins and feathers that had been dyed blue with berries. Yet other sources say that Saul Collins' nickname was Blue, and since he discovered the cryptid first, they named it after him. And as far as what the creature was, most claim it's nothing more than a legend, while others think that Saul Collins actually seen a bear, and maybe exaggerated parts of the story, while others believe he saw a true undiscovered animal. And this concludes Part 5 of the Southern Unsolved Mystery Iceberg Explained. I hope you all enjoyed.